Cultus Vegetabilis. It is not the purpose of this article to depreciate any intelligent consideration of the problem of diet, but rather to remind the average individual that he lives so badly it is hardly necessary for him to live longer than a span of moderation will permit. With all his intemperances, man generally succeeds in outliving his usefulness. Why should he struggle so for added years only to waste them? Life is not really important unless it is lived intelligently. Philosophers do not care how long they live, their prime concern is how well they can live. Longevity is a curse except to the wise. This does not mean we should strive to hasten our own decease, but that living moderately in all things we should fill the years with useful deeds and face disillusion with a good hope. We should all strive to be healthy, for bodily ailments divert the mind from the cultivation of reason to the contemplation of corporeal indisposition. Few can ignore the irritations of the flesh. But then, again, a healthy man is not one who, possessing only a superabundance of animal vitality, frisks about on his vitamins. A healthy man is one who is free from mental and spiritual disease. In other words, one who is comfortable as the result of a healthy coordination of his parts. Normalcy is absolutely indispensable to health, and he who departs from normal things departs from God and reason. About 1/3 of what a man eats lengthens his life and contributes to his well-being. The other 2/3 shortens his day and destroys peace of mind and body. We all eat not wisely, but too much. The American people are an amazing order of gastronomes who, like the Lacedaemonians described by Diogenes, build their houses as though they would live forever and eat as though they would die tomorrow and never have another chance. Nor is it entirely what we eat. The way we eat is also important. Haste is the enemy of all temperance. If we must eat, and we shall probably have to, unless science amends an act of providence, we should eat leisurely, comfortably, and joyously. A man is what he eats, solemnly declares the enthusiast, quoting his favorite authority in the same final tone that his grandfather used when quoting from Ecclesiastes. This is not literally true, for the process of assimilation is not only physical but also metaphysical. The individuality of food is destroyed before it is actually incorporated into the system. If this were not true, inveterate asparagus eaters might burst into fern. Take, for example, the cow. This gentle bovine should be the dietitian's delight. Here we have a perfect example of thorough mastication and the monodiet carried to the last legitimate extremity. If normal eating were the prime requisite of perfection and the royal road to nirvana, cows would be at least archangels. Alfalfa and tall luscious grasses, bits of fragrant clover, and occasionally even a more fragrant wild onion have made that cow what it is today, if certain of our leading authorities on health are to be believed. But what human creature sitting down to a plate heaped up with the miscellaneous herbage really desires to have this miracle worked on him and spend the rest of his life combating a tendency to flick fleas and chew cuds? If what a being eats really is the measure of its personality and activity, a diet would be very hard to choose, for there is really nothing that a man eats which he would actually like to become, although some do seemingly take on appearances. An animal is valued for its weight or strength, but a man for the quality of his reason. It is quite astonishing how many specialists die on the very disease which they have made their life study. It seems that repeated thinking brings into actual objectivity the substance of that thought. By the same rule, we discovered that a great number of diet fattists suffer from stomach and intestinal troubles. The stomach seems to be a shy and retiring organ. It is patient under abuse, but when given too much publicity and attention becomes so embarrassed that it cannot function properly. A life spent counting calories is a life utterly wasted, because like the other things of this world which men prize, calories are impermanent and pass away. Follow a few simple laws of eating, with which everyone is familiar but which all alike disregard, and realizing that the body was designed to bear a certain burden of abuse, devote time and energy to the achievement of greater and more permanent good. Almost every year evangelists come preaching some new excess. In the old days, these prophets completely upset our emotional nature with their promises of heaven and fears of hell. We broke into a cold sweat and were baptized amidst the loud amens and hallelujahs of a congregation, who were all excited but had no idea of what it was about. When the sawdust trail began to wane, the great psychological circus began, and our mental equilibrium was all upset by the dreadful realization that we were a bundle of undiagnosed complexes, which could not be remedied until our favorite psychologist had vaccinated our subconscious mind. After the psychologists became real estate and oil salesmen, the country had a pretty bad attack of yogi-itis, which, like the Mediterranean fruit fly, was an imported dilemma. We syncopated our breathing and sat around bundled up in blankets, attempting the difficult experiment of looking at the navel with one eye and the pineal gland with the other, at the same time thinking intently about nothing. The same types of people who went hysterical over the metaphysicians, psychologists, and yogis of past years are coming out now with a new hysteria: diet. They have rehemmed their frayed nerves and, ready to be fooled again, listen with open-mouthed wonder to some picture of life and vitality as he instructs them how to eat their way to happiness, prosperity, and centenarianism. The evangelist of longevity arrives right behind several truckloads of garden stuff. The Greeks, Sicilians, Italians, Koreans, Japanese, and other members of 100% American farming class dump their prudence and proclaim a national holiday. The decorators then get busy, and soon the front of the lecture hall where the apostle to the gourmands is to speak is artistically festooned with strings of cabbages, clusters of onions, bouquets of radishes, and bunches of honest carrots. There will also be photographs of the speaker lifting high with one hand a festive squash, while with the other he holds out invitingly a package of his favorite laxative. He will also have placards circulated among the greengrocers advising humanity in general to eat more broccoli, as a remedy for the present financial depression. The day that the spinach is draped about the pillars and arches of the auditorium, it is a verdant, if unusual, decoration. The second day, however, there is a depressed and wilted look, and by the third day the deterioration is simply terrible. To even behold the exhibition destroys one's appetite for a fortnight. When finally the janitor untwines the wreckage, it is painfully evident that the dietitians should use wax or crepe paper vegetables for display purposes. At last comes the big night when Demon Starch is to receive his death blow, when all the ills of mankind are to be swept away with a bunch of celery. The house is packed with apparently healthy people who will never know how sick they are until the professor gets through telling them. The prophet of food values appears and welcomes his vast audience with a cheery, "How are you eliminating?" His first task is to sell himself, to prove that all that he has he owes to a mixture of rhubarb and sourgum. He takes off his coat, then his vest, and threatens to remove his shirt in order that his muscular development may duly impress the assemblage. He runs up and down, climbs up on the readers' desks, swings back and forth by the plush drapery, kneels like Al Jolson singing Mammy, pleading all the while for men to leave their pills and ills and follow him down the garlic-strewn path to success. He pounds his own chest and tells them that he is 90 years old, born in 1895, that he has never been sick a day in his life, and that no one need ever ail again if they will but now, here this very moment, buy a little package of nature's own favorite physic for the ridiculously low price of $1. If business does not start immediately, our revivalist depicts graphically the mysteries of our intestinal tract, warning us that at every moment we are dying and we don't know it. And very soon the line forms to the right. While the little boxes of immortality are being distributed, arrangements are made for the big class that is to follow, where all the mysteries of life will be explained and from which you will emerge almost too wise to remain on this planet. In summarizing the health platform, we would like to describe a symposium given by the health expert in which the lame, the halt, and the blind brought their own lunches at his direction and ate them under his supervision. The words of the janitor who cleaned the hall the following day are most eloquent. "Yes, sir, if that wasn't the worst mess I've seen in 25 years of cleaning out buildings. I'd like to never got the dirt out. What they didn't eat, they threw on the floor and walked on. And will you believe it? They were serving out raw flour, mixing it up with garlic and honey and eating it. Most of the flour and no small amount of the honey was on them carpets, too. I mean, to tell you. The worst bunch of nuts I've ever seen. If I had to eat stuff like that, death would be a pleasure. Leaving the janitor to moan over the general deterioration of mankind, we will conclude our remarks by simply restating the original premise. Hysterical dieting is just as dangerous as any other form of hysteria, and stomacholatry is a dangerous form of religion. The good book was not far wrong when it declared that which cometh out of the mouth defileth a man much more than that which goeth in. Eat moderately, think creatively, and work hard. These are the secrets of health. Some notes on numerology. The flames which destroyed the Pythagorean University at Crotona left little besides speculation upon which to reconstruct the learning of this most noble institution. The master perished with his school. The offended pride of ignorance had sought once more to justify itself by destroying that which it could not understand. A few charred fragments remained, but these at best give only hints of a system so profound that it has been said that only Pythagoras himself ever actually understood it. Even the Neo-Pythagoreans of Alexandria, laboring within 500 years of the great initiate's death, were incapable of reconstructing his doctrine so completely had the traditions been obliterated. Plato was the philosophic successor of Pythagoras, and although he approached the problem of learning from a somewhat different viewpoint, we find much Pythagoreanism scattered throughout his writings, and we know that he paid a great price for some partly destroyed manuscripts, presumably discovered amidst the ashes of Crotona. Today we hear much of Pythagoras and his philosophy, and several more or less metaphysical systems are ascribed to him. Careful examination, however, will demonstrate the fallacy of these claims, for nothing resembling an orderly body of doctrine has descended to us from the Samian sage. The systems circulated under his name are of three classes. First, ancient speculation advanced in his own day by those uninitiated into the true Pythagorean mysteries. Second, medieval fabrications brewed in a witch's kitchen of magic and superstition. Third, the theories of modern writers, who, seeking to invest their opinions with an honorable toga, lay them at the door of this illustrious ancient. Where nothing is known, everything is suspected, and it is difficult to tell where fragments of the original tradition leave off and the forgeries begin. One thing is certain, little of the philosophy now attributed to Pythagoras does his memory much credit, and to have gained for himself the title of the Son of God, he must have been the author of better stuff. Today, when we think of Pythagoras, we are immediately minded of numerology. The ghost of the old philosopher invokes thoughts of birth paths and soulmates, and we pant after these memories. The purpose of this article is not to enlarge upon the merits or demerits of numerology, a sort of chiropractic psychology with which we straighten out the curvatures of life by a scientific adjustment to vowels and consonants. Numerology is unquestionably based upon a Pythagorean system of interchanging letters and numbers. At this point, the correspondence ends, however, for the method of interpreting these numbers and arriving at the various sums involved cannot be referred to Pythagoras. This does not necessarily mean that modern numerology cannot justify its existence, but it does mean that it conveys an impression which is likely to divert the mind from the weightier and more philosophical aspects of numerical philosophy. To Pythagoras, numbers and their combinations were the elements of a magnificent philosophic system, which introduced the thoughtful to the most profound verities of God and nature. True numerology was philosophic, and divination by numbers was but an accidental aspect. The Gnostic Christians employed the Kabbalistic and Pythagorean number system as keys to the interpretation of the mysteries of the New Testament. Marcius, a disciple of Valentinus who lived during the middle of the 2nd century and whom Jerome declared to have been an Egyptian, particularly excelled in the mathematical mysteries. It would be incorrect to presume that Marcius followed the details of the Pythagorean system, but he certainly did gather such general information as was available and fashioned therefrom an extraordinary series of correspondences. He established beyond all reasonable doubt that the names and titles bestowed at some remote period upon the gods were susceptible of a profound interpretation, based on combining the numerical equivalents by the letters of which the names were composed. Pythagoras had contacted the mystics of the Holy Land and such as survived of the wise men of Babylon and Chaldea, and from them he learned many Kabbalistic secrets, even as he secured the keys of transcendental geometry from the Egyptians. He was the first to bring to Greece the organized occult traditions of Asia, and he alone knew why the Babylonians declared that the number of 60 represented Pluto, 50 Jupiter, 40 Neptune, 30 the Moon, 10 the air, 12 Mars, and 10 also Saturn. Although Rawlinson assures us that these numbers signify not only the gods but also the planetary bodies themselves, he can give no clue as to the reason for his choice. In his essay on Isis and Osiris, Plutarch writes, "When the Pythagoreans appropriate the names of several of the gods to particular numbers, as that of Apollo to the unit, of Diana to the duad, of Minerva to the 7, and of Neptune to the first cube, it is my opinion, I say, that in this they allude to something which the founder of their sect saw in the Egyptian temples, to some ceremonies performed in them, or to some symbols there exhibited." In another place, the same author adds, "For as the power of the triangle is expressive of the nature of Pluto, Bacchus, and Mars, the properties of the square of Rhea, Venus, Ceres, Vesta, and June, of the dodecahedron of Jupiter, so, as we are informed by Eudoxus, is the figure of the 56 angles expressive of the nature of Typhon." These two quotations will give a fairly comprehensive idea of the type of hints that have come down to us, fragments so desultory and archaic that each renders the confusion worse confounded. Before we present for your consideration a few of the genuine fragments of the numerical philosophy, which have descended to this age, it might be interesting to insert what is called the Kabbalistic Catechism, an illuminating contribution on the subject. Question: what is the generative number? Answer: in the divinity, it is the unit. In created things, the number 2, because the divinity, 1, engenders 2, and in created things, 2 engenders 1. Question: what is the most majestic number? 3, because it denotes the triple divine essence. What is the most mysterious number? 4, because it contains all the mysteries of nature. What is the most occult number? 5, because it is enclosed in the center of the series. Which is the most salutary number? 6, because it contains the source of our spiritual and corporeal happiness. Which is the most fortunate number? 7, because it leads us to the decad, the perfect number. Which is the number most to be desired? 8, because he who possesses it is of the number of Elus and the sages. Which is the most sublime number? 9, because by it religion and nature are exalted. Which is the most perfect number? 10, because it includes unity, which created everything, and 0, symbol of matter and chaos, and the end, power and force, life and annihilation. Pythagoras employed numbers as symbols of and gateways leading to those principles of life from which inferior bodies are suspended as effects depend from causes. He therefore divided his numerical symbolism into 2 parts, the first devoted to the nature of causes and the second devoted to the nature of effects. Those numbers which referred to causes he called intellectual, and those which referred to effects sciential. The intellectual numbers are archetypal patterns which exist externally in the divine mind, and sciential numbers are the creatures, or rather the measure of the creatures, which are temporarily objectified from the thoughts of God. The intellectual numbers which were suspended from the idea of intellectual number were called the monad, the duad, the triad, the tetrad, the pentad, the hexad, the heptad, the ogdode, ennead, and the decad, and their correspondences in the sciential numbers were the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. From Moderatus of Gades, we learn the difference between the intellectual and sciential numbers when he terms the monad the seminal reason of the one, or again, where he expresses it, monad amongst numbers, one amongst things numbered. Thus, numbers and things numbered occupy in relationship to each other positions corresponding to spirit and matter. We may also say that whereas the numbers, scientially speaking, numerate the parts, the intellectual numbers are all unities signifying dignity and attribute rather than quality. Thus, the sciential number 8 signifies 8 ones or 8 parts, but the ogdode, which is the intellectual concept of 8, is an undivided principle, the symbolic name for an order of divine procedure. Through the numbers, therefore, say the Pythagoreans, man approaches a realization of number. In other words, through the diversity of nature, men approach a realization of the unity of life and of God. Each of the intellectual numbers has a keyword. In fact, a strange confusion of definitions has come down to us from ancient writers. The monad was termed spirit as being the first wholeness which emerged from chaos. All numbers, both intellectual and sciential, arise from and ultimately retire to the monad. Hence Pythagoras, in propitiating this number, addressed it thus: "Hear, noble number, sire of gods and men." The duad was termed soul because the soul is divided in its allegiance, at some times inclining towards spirit, and at others verging towards matter. Hence the two is also called instability or ignorance because foolish persons are vacillating. The triad was termed mind because it orders the duad, bringing equilibrium and the sense of reason. The tetrad was termed body because a body is composed of the 4 Platonic elements of mind, science, opinion, and sense, and is the 4th extension, of which a point, a line, and a surface are the first 3. The tetrahedron is the simplest of all geometrical solids, having but 4 surfaces. The pentad is termed nature, being the union of the duad and triad. It is termed the fountain of souls, the seat of celestials, and the throne of the world. The hexad is termed harmony and was sacred to Venus, who was called the mother of harmony. It was also related with time as being half of the sacred 12, which signifies the year, and a quarter of the mystical 24, which, in turn, represents the hours of the day. The heptad is termed order because 7 signifies those laws of creation, which are the inflexible will of the creative agent. The heptad was sacred to Minerva because she signified the plan born from or in the mind of her father. The ogdode was termed equilibrium, or justice, because of all the numbers it is the most equal. By its form, the 8 reveals the equilibrium of the worlds and also the courses of the celestial bodies. The ennead was termed Prometheus, for it signified the expiation of sin and the principle of sacrifice. It was also the peculiar symbol of man. The decad was termed perfection, for in it all shortcomings ceased. Among the Pythagorean names for this symbol were heaven, the world, and fate. The ancient oracles declared that the gods would send all manners of calamities to any man who changed the names of the gods. This was done to protect the Kabbalistic importance of these names, so that the enlightened of some future age might benefit from the erudition of the first philosophers. It is not difficult to discover the numerical values of the letters of the Greek and Hebrew alphabets, where Kabbalism and Pythagoreanism have their origin, but an effort to transfer the system to the English alphabet has proved hopelessly confusing. To begin with, the Greek and Hebrew characters are presumed to have been revelations from the gods, and were essentially religious and philosophical alphabets. Such does not seem to be the case with the English. We are a materialistic people who created our language not for the worship of the divinities, but with an eye to the more imminent problems of barter and exchange. The numerical value of some of the English letters can be rather easily discovered from their Greek and Hebrew correspondences, but some of the letters of the older alphabets have no English equivalents, and at this point speculation runs riot. The following table, though necessarily incomplete, is at least approximately correct and may serve as a basis for further calculation. A equals 1, B equals 2, G 3, D 4, E 5, F or V 6, I 10, C 20, L 30, M 40, N 50, O 70, P 80, R 100, S 200, T 300, and U 400. Pythagoras had several other divisions of numbers as to their attributes of multitude, magnitude, quantity, quality, etc. He divided sciential numbers into odd and even, declaring that the odd numbers were sacred to the gods who should be propitiated with offerings consisting of odd numbers of objects. The even numbers were also worthy of veneration, but were assigned to inferior spirits and terrestrial creatures. Odd numbers were creative, whereas even numbers signified areas or conditions awaiting the action of the creative forces. All numbers were primarily intended to stimulate ideas, being in reality only symbolic of ideas. The mind attracted to an object for the consideration of its numerical attributes was invited by the numbers to investigate and admire those celestial causes, which precipitated its corporeal appearance. The purpose of the Pythagorean disciplines was to so stimulate the reason that it became capable of recognizing and assimilating. One of the Pythagoreans aptly wrote that there are realities in nature which are not susceptible of interpretation through the conventional methods of symbolism. Thus no bodies can be ascribed, nor will carven images imply the truths. Even sounds or harmonies fail. But of all human devices, numbers are the most appropriate. The numerals convey the sense of quality and quantity without the impediment of form or the limitations of place and time. Thus, through a study of the numerical philosophy, the eye of the internal perceptions may be opened without the mind being filled by erroneous concepts resulting from grosser forms of symbolism. Approaching the Christian period, when the Gnostics were striving to establish Christianity as a synthesis of the classical pagan religions, Pythagoreanism was revived with telling force by the Marcosians. In the symbolism of this cult, we find a curious blending of letter and number values in an effort to demonstrate that Christ signified the eternal logos of the pagans, rather than an exception to all previous cosmical order, as he was preached by the apostles. Two extraordinary symbols stand out in the Gnostic system. The first is the correlation of the vowels, the planets, and the seven heavens. The Gnostic pantheos was often depicted with the seven vowels over its head to signify the seven spirits before the throne. These seven spirits were the planetary angels, or as Hermes called them, the governors of the world, and each had a particular vowel ascribed to it. The heavens were depicted as a series of concentric circles radiating from the surface of the earth, with the sacred vowel which it sounded prominently displayed. The first heaven was that of the moon, and it sounded the vowel alpha. The second heaven was that of Mercury, and it sounded the vowel epsilon. The third heaven was that of Venus, and it sounded the vowel eta. The fourth heaven was that of the sun, and it sounded the vowel iota. The fifth heaven was that of Mars, and it sounded the vowel omicron. The sixth heaven was that of Jupiter, and it sounded the vowel upsilon. And the seventh heaven was that of Saturn, and sounded the vowel omega. For the eta we can substitute y, and for the upsilon, w. By so doing, the system will correspond very closely with that of the English vowels, but we cannot depend upon the meanings being identical. From this classification, it becomes evident that the first and the last heaven together sound the alpha and the omega, and the value of these two letters together is 801. By Gnostic permutation, which adds the separate units of the sum, the number becomes 9. Now, among our keywords of intellectual numbers, we find that the 9 stands for Prometheus and for sacrifice. Therefore, Jesus, the sin offering of the people, is referred to as the Alpha and the Omega, signifying his identity with the mystery of Prometheus. This is the way the system works. The Greek word for dove, when the letters are changed into numbers, also adds up to 801, which intimates that the dove and the Alpha and Omega have identical symbolical significance. The six-lettered name of Jesus in Greek has its numerical equivalent, 888, the sum of which 24 or 6, a number agreeing with the original number of letters in the name. Furthermore, the Passion of Christ began in the 6th hour and ended in the 6th hour. We find the number 6 associated with the mysteries of Venus, the morning star. In Oriental symbolism, this represents the illumined or regenerated mind, which mind, in its Greek symbolism, is also interpreted by the number 888. Marcius demonstrated that all the letters of the alphabet and all the mysteries of the vowels and consonants which constituted the world were bound up in the mystery name of Jesus. The Marcosians divided the alphabet into 3 parts, of which the first consisted of 9 mutes, which pertain to the Father himself, because they are ineffable and cannot be sounded or spoken. The second consisted of 8 semivowels, which are the logos, or the soul, or life, because they are midway between the mutes and the vowels partaking of divinity from above and mortality from below. The third consisted of 7 vowels or sacred sounds, which pertain to the outer world, to man, and to the assembly or aggregation of the righteous. These 7, 8, and 9 parts, when added together, constituted the entire alphabet of 24 letters. If the 7, 8, and 9 be written 7, 8, 9, and then one number be taken from the 9 and added to the 7, the result is again 888. Marcius further shows how in the Greek system there are 8 single numbers, 8 decades and 8 hundreds, and that these, if added with certain philosophic liberties, can be read 888 so that Jesus becomes the sum of the alphabet. To show how curiously the system has been evolved, if we add the numerical value of the 7 vowels together, the sum is 1294. If the parts of this are again added, the result can be reduced to 7, so that the keynote of the 7 worlds is itself the 7 and no contradictions or inconsistencies exist. We should pause in passing long enough to note the famous 666, the apocalyptic number of the beast. Each of the names given to the Antichrist in the writings of Irenaeus total numerically 666, which reduces itself to 9 to reveal that man's own lower nature or animal soul is the beast of Revelation. Using the table of numerical values of the letters of the English alphabet, let us try to prove an old Kabbalistic assertion that Adam was simply a term applied to the whole of mankind and not to a solitary progenitor of the race. Also, we shall try to discover if Philo was correct in assuming that Adam was identical with the Platonic archetypal man, the pattern of humanity existing in the mind of God. By referring to our table, we find that A equals 1, D4, A1, and M40. We use the English spelling. The sum of these is 46, or 10, or 1. In our table of intellectual numbers, 1 is the spiritual source, or the monad, from which all diversity is suspended. Thus, Philo is justified in describing Adam as a sort of monad of mankind. In sciential numbers, Adam is 1 and 10, the first and the last man, and also the whole man, or the human race. If we want confirmation, let us turn to the table again and take the word man, for which Adam should be a synonym. We find that M is 40, A is 1, and N is 50. The sum is 91, or 10 again, so that we are justified in regarding the two terms as synonymous. It was with such mysteries of universal processes and purposes that the first philosophers were concerned. It was to assist man in clarifying the riddle of his own origin and destiny that the numerical sciences were formulated, and it is to such end that they should be directed today if the dignity of the ancient wisdom is to be preserved. But human beings are selfish and personal. They are interested in fortune-telling, not philosophy, and the state of their soul worries them far less than the estate of their body. We are in a period during which learning is decadent, when superficialities are elevated and profundities ignored. We can but hope for a more philosophic era. By hoping, we can bind ourselves to the task of bringing about that state which we desire. The mystery of the feathered serpent. One has but to examine the surviving fragments of the Nahuatlian mythology and history to realize that a high order of metaphysical learning existed among the original Americans. Even Roman Catholic writers admitted that magic flourished among the peoples of Mexico, and that the priests and philosophers of that nation were deeply versed in astrology and the necromantic arts. The episode of the arrest and detention of 2 Aztec sorcerers, accused by the Church of attempting to weave spells against the Christian clergy, is especially interesting, for even the pious fathers were forced to admit that their prisoners dissolved into empty air before their very eyes, a circumstance which was passed over very lightly. The ill-fated Montezuma was surrounded by seers and prophets who, from signs which appeared in the heavens, warned the emperor that the conquistadors, with their horses and guns, were not emissaries from the sun god, but plundering mortals with an eye for loot. Montezuma, being a great prince, was well learned in the lore of his people, and it was this very learning that proved his undoing. The most ancient traditions of his race, perpetuated by the wisest of each generation, declared that the history of the world was divided into 5 great epochs. These 5 vast periods were separated from each other by great cataclysms in which great portions of mankind perished. In the Codex Vaticanus, it is written that in the first age water reigned supreme until at last it rose up and swallowed all creatures save 2 who had escaped by means of a tree. As the form of a ship appears in this tradition, it is likely that the tree was hollowed out to form a crude boat in which the Mexican Noah and his wife rode safely over the deluge. In this first age, there was also giants and strange monsters with teeth that weighed 3 pounds each. The second age was that of wind, which, by the force of its blowing, finally destroyed the whole world. 1 man and 1 woman survived this destruction also by concealing themselves within a hollow stone, which was so heavy that the wind could not blow it away. During this period, great masses of humanity were changed into apes. The third age was that of fire and was ended by a terrible outburst of flames which burned up the world. Again, a Noah and his wife were saved, this time by seeking refuge in subterranean caverns where the terrible heat could not reach them. The fourth age was that of present humanity, and its destruction will be brought about by sin, the sin of man. It is called in the Old Codex the Age of the Black Hair. It was in the early centuries of this age that the great race of the Toltecs, under their divine priest-king Quetzalcoatl, were destroyed by the sorcery of the Nahuas, under their demon war god, Tezcatlipoca. All this Montezuma knew, and from the same traditions he had also learned that a 5th age was to come, a golden age in which the gods would return, or more correctly, turn with favor to the Aztec nation, through their ministering intermediary, the feathered snake. Quetzalcoatl had promised to return leading a mighty army that should deliver Mexico from its afflictions and its bondage to the gods of war and death. When the ships of Cortez anchored in the harbor at Veracruz, Montezuma immediately dispatched messengers with offerings and protestations of allegiance. These, paddling their canoes to the sides of the Spanish vessels, made known as best they could that they had come in search of the great white god of the sun. Cortez and his companions, amazed beyond words, but determined to benefit by the circumstances, decided upon subterfuge. Cortez put on his most splendid garments and his most highly polished armor. He had a throne erected for himself on the deck of the ship and created as much of an atmosphere of dignity as circumstances permitted. Then, with mock solemnity, he received the ambassadors of Montezuma, conveying to them the impression that he was the great white prince of the feathered snake, whom they awaited so long. The mere coincidence that Cortez arrived at Veracruz on the very anniversary of the departure of Quetzalcoatl gave even greater credence to the Indians' belief that the Aztec messengers fell on their knees before Cortez, and after kissing the deck of the ship and performing other rites of homage, they crowned the Spanish conqueror in a bonnet of Quetzal plumes, robed him in ceremonial vestments, and honored him as the very person of the god. The ambassadors then explained that Montezuma, in all humility, besought the returned god to accept back his kingdom and bestow the gift of wisdom and peace upon his people. Montezuma was a man of considerable personal integrity, and his attitude throughout the whole entire period of the Spanish invasion was most commendable. He was neither a proud nor a warlike monarch, his earlier actions being marked with humility and his later ones goaded by desperation and abuse. It is said of Montezuma that when he was called to the throne, the ministers sent to find him discovered the prince sweeping out the courtyard of the temple, and that they had to take the broom from his hands to make him king. Montezuma admitted that many of the priceless treasures of his people's religion had been lost or forgotten in the numerous vicissitudes through which the nation had passed. Therefore, he besought the returned god to restate the tenets of life and truth. The confidence which the Aztec king reposed in Cortez was utterly betrayed, and the virtuous advances which the Indian prince made were turned against him, becoming the major causes of his downfall and cruel death. The old gods of the Aztecs, however, were not totally unavenged, for when the Spaniards began the colonization of Mexico, they died by thousands, not from Aztec spears, but from plagues generated in the marshes and bogs, which surrounded the great Aztec capital. Quetzalcoatl was a name to conjure with, and its power was known from the southern borders to the United States to the high peaks of the Andes. By the Quiches, he was called Gucamaz, by the Mayans, Kukulkan, and by the Incas, possibly Tonopa. He was not only a hero king, but the central figure of a mystery cult served by a hierarchy of priests who termed themselves serpents, and by virtue of their rituals of consecration partook to the very nature of the god himself. The initiates of the Quetzalcoatl cult, as we learn from the writing of de Bourbourg, referred to themselves as the sons of the snakes, or in another place, the serpents. There is also reference to a subterranean passageway which leads to the roots of heaven. This passage is called the Snake's Hole, and only a serpent may enter it. Here is occult symbolism in no uncertain terms. That the serpent hole which leads to heaven is only for such mortals as have become snakes is equivalent to the statement in the Old Testament that the mysteries of God are only for the initiates. It was customary among ancient peoples to conceal the elements of their philosophical doctrines under mythical adventures, ascribed to a hero god who was the personification of the whole mystical system. The legends of Hiawatha are of such origin, as well as most of the stories concerning Jesus, Buddha, and other great world teachers. The legends of Quetzalcoatl are no departure from this well-established rule. In his birth, life, and death, we have all the elements of a cosmic myth, skillfully treated with definite emphasis upon the theogonic and astronomical elements. Before entering upon the actual life of the God-man, certain explanations are necessary. In the first place, the material from which these accounts are derived is extremely fragmentary, being only the mutilated remnants of a once great literature. Hence there must be breaks in the thread of the story. In the second place, the tale is made up from the traditions of several nations, each of which has added local color to the narrative. In the third place, nearly all whom have attempted to interpret the old legend have done so from an entirely materialistic standpoint, giving no credence whatever to the metaphysical elements involved. Brasseur de Bourbourg and Auguste Le Plongeon were both transcendentally minded, but their efforts find small favor in the eyes of so-called practically minded archaeologists. True, Lord Kingsborough in 1835 attempted to prove that Quetzalcoatl was an Americanized form of Christ, and that the traditions concerning him had been brought by some early missionary, possibly St. Thomas. The present status of the Mexican mythology problem may be summed up in the thought that most men of letters are militantly opinionated, and that where their opinions run riot, small heed is taken of facts. To start at the beginning, then, we must ask who were the Toltecs. To show how obscure the subject really is, we find serious debate as to whether such a race ever actually existed. Those opposing the historicity of the Toltecs declare that the accounts of this people are so mixed up with astronomical cycles that the whole account should be regarded as entirely mythological and related to some previous state of man in the heavenly world, or possibly to the progressions of the planets and constellations. Those affirming the reality of the Toltecs declare them to be one of the earliest migrations of the Nahua stock, which moved southward into the Valley of Mexico from the mysterious land of Aztlan, the place of the reeds. Several legends exist concerning the origin of the Nahua peoples, whose sacred land was called Tlapalan, which means the country of bright colors. It is also believed that they may have come from Chicamotoc, the sacred 7 caverns in the earth. Lewis Spence is of the opinion that these 2 localities might be New Mexico or Arizona. On the other hand, some of the most authentic traditions point to the fact that Tlapalan could be reached only by water. It has been connected with Atlantic by some writers, while others believe that Asia was the origin and that these tribes preserved traditions of their migration across Bering Strait by means of canoes. There is an ever-increasing belief in the reality of the Toltec people, but if the philosophical facts were known, the whole account might parallel Plato's description of Atlantis, which is a symbolical and allegorical depiction based upon historical circumstances. In other words, facts and fancy have been woven together to serve the purposes of a priestcraft bent on the preservation of metaphysical truths. According to the historian Itzlitzochitl, the Toltecs founded the city of Tolan about the year 566 AD. Tolan is now identified with the Mexican city of Tula, about 50 miles from Mexico City. There's a tradition that the Toltecs were led in this migration by a magician who finally, with the aid of divination, selected the spot upon which the great center of empire was to be established. Now, if the Toltec civilization did not arise until the 6th century AD, It is scarcely probable that it was to these people that Quetzalcoatl came. He would seem to be much earlier. This leads us to believe that the term Toltec is susceptible of two interpretations. While the term has been given to the first migrations of the Nahuas, it may also apply to a mythological period which preceded historical civilization, a period such as we find recorded in Greece during which the gods walked with men and mysterious things might happen. We follow the historical accounts of the Toltecs as that nation rose to great heights in the arts and sciences. And then we trace the decline in virtue and integrity which finally precipitated this proud people into oblivion. It is evident that in the last ages of the Toltec Empire, Quetzalcoatl was regarded by them as their patron deity, and his power was invoked to protect them from Tezcatlipoca, the war genius of certain primitive Nahua tribes that finally destroyed the Toltec Empire. But there is a strange silence among the histories as to the actual presence of Quetzalcoatl as a prince or a leader at that time, and we are forced to assume that the Toltecs to whom this prince came in person were the heavenly progenitors of the nation upon the earth. While dates and places are hopelessly confused, the astonishing profundity of the Quetzalcoatl myth and its correspondence to the mystery rituals of the classical pagan world cannot but awaken admiration and a desire to understand its meaning more clearly. To be continued.